Hey, Tiasha, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for inviting me to the show, Abena.
Great. So, for those of you listening, I featured on Tiasha's podcast, host of Faces of Digital Health, not too long ago. And I'm really excited to introduce her to the doctor community because she has a wealth of experience in podcasting, digital health, and all that jazz. And I'm sure that some of you could really benefit from her knowledge, expertise, wisdom, insights, you name it, on that process of becoming one of the most influential podcasters in health tech around. So welcome. Let's get started with your background. So actually, where are you based at the moment?
So I'm based in Ljubljana, Slovenia, Central Europe.
Amazing. And do you feel like being in the center of Europe, your reach has been able to kind of become circumferential, if that makes any sense? So you've managed to get listeners from all of Europe, I assume, UK and beyond, USA. Like where are your listeners mainly from?
So basically, I would say probably 40% of listeners are still in the US, then probably 20 to 30 in Europe, and the rest of the around the world. So, from the moment I began, I wanted to make this an international podcast. Hence, I work in English. I get international speakers and are careful with selecting speakers that have good English, or there's just more work to do in the post-production.
Great. Well, let's go to the beginning. You come from a very strong journalistic background. So could you just outline why you decided to start a podcast in the first place? Like how did that, because obviously you weren't originally in health tech, is that correct? You weren't originally in health.
So basically, I worked for a medical monthly magazine for doctors when in my last full-time journalistic job. And one of the things that I was also doing after a few years in was audience development for the whole company. So just looking at new ways to connect with the audience, new ways to get the content out, try to find new opportunities for the medium as such. So so I thought, let's start podcasting, So we did one podcast that was in Slovene. That was because the company that I was working for had a financial newspaper and a lot of other magazines, and one of those magazines was also this medical journal that I was working for. And given that we had many sister kind of companies or magazines across Europe, because we were owned by a Swedish company, and the same brand was present in many countries across Europe, I thought it would be great if we had an international medtech podcast that would be able to connect all these kind of separate divisions in different countries. Eventually, so I started doing the podcast in English, but then I changed that job, and I still wanted to keep doing the podcast because it was a way for me to still stay in journalism. It's just the profession that I still love. So that's why I kind of continued doing the podcast.
Brilliant. So how long has it been now?
It's been 5 years now.
How many episodes?
A little bit over 200, approaching 210.
So when you first, I mean, that's impressive, I have to say, that's really impressive. So when you first started this journey, could you imagine 5 years down the line, you'd be still doing it, motivated, interviewing influential speakers? Is that what your intention was? What were you thinking when you first started?
So I kind of did, because from the get-go, my goal was for this to be a long-term commitment, and more or less to see where it will take me in 5 to 10 years time. So I was focused more on that than on other metrics that might potentially discourage me from continuing, So at the beginning, I was just publishing one episode every 2 weeks, and then 2 or 3 years ago, I just started doing one per week. And once I started doing that, it was really hard to just go back to just one every 2 weeks. So I'm now running a weekly podcast, which has its own challenges. We may dive into that a little bit later. But yeah, I definitely imagined myself still doing this after 5 years.
And are you still enjoying it?
Yes, very much.
Wow.
More every day, because after a while you just you get into the hang of what it takes to prepare a show, and you can really rethink what is it that you want to achieve with the podcast, what kind of messages do you want to put out, what kind of content do you want to create. So yeah, some things get easier, new challenges arise, as with anything.
Sure. So I mean, as you know, today's focus question is how and why would you set up a podcast as a doctor? So from all of your learnings and insights over the years, why would doctors want to set up a podcast? Like, what have you seen? What are the main reasons that doctors have actually gone out there and put their voice out to the world in a very vulnerable way in some ways?
Yeah. Well, it depends on what kind of podcast do you want to have. Or do you want to have a podcast where you're the only speaker and you just, talk to the audience, have a very short message that you want to put out? Or do you want to do interviews? Or do you want to do even different sorts of content? Like off the top of my head, one reason why I would imagine doctors might want to start a podcast is if they feel like they're not being heard. And we know what a hierarchy looks like in healthcare and medicine. So that would definitely be one way of trying to amplify your message and see if it resonates with someone else. So it could be either for advocacy, it could be just so if you do interviews, to expand your network, to meet new people. When you're talking to new people, you get new ideas, you reflect on your own story, your own challenges, and how you could get past them. There's various options. Once you get a hand of it, it can bring speaking opportunities, networking opportunities. If you're running a business, it might be easier to get in contact with people just because you want to maybe do an interview with them. So there's a really wide range of benefits that you might get if you dive into this space.
And can you think of any, I mean, you may be aware of any podcasts run by doctors that have stood out in your mind? Are there any in particular that you can think of that have been like, actually, that's a really good podcast, and why?
Yes, so let me just check because in 2020, when the pandemic started, the number of podcasts really just skyrocketed. So there's a lot more podcasts out there today than there used to be. And many doctors, nurses started their podcasts. You can go to the Health Podcast Network to find all sorts of podcasts. So one that is just kind of on top of my mind. Let me just find the name of it. Just a second. Oh yeah, of course. So the podcast by Kevin MD. Kevin
Kevin
MD
MD.
is
He's just
important.
prolific.
Yeah. He's kind of like the influencer, thought leader, very vocal, very known because of his newsletter, because of his blog posts, and now also has a podcast. So he's just kind of the first one that comes to mind. But if you go to the Health Podcast Network, you're going to find a bunch of other podcasts as well. Hospitals from the US have their own podcasts, such as Mayo Clinic. So there really is a lot of content out there already. So it's if you the question wasn't how would I advise people to do podcasts, but I kind of feel that that's something that might be useful for people to hear. And so if you are thinking about doing a podcast, obviously the first thing to do would be to just see what's already on the market, see what kind of messages people are putting out, and then try to figure out how do you differentiate, how are you going to position yourself to be different than others. That's like the number one thing that you need to be clear about if you want to just stand out, and you have to stand out in your own way to attract audience.
I think you've made a really, really good point there, because from what I understand, the podcasting market is not saturated, probably one of the most undersaturated if you look at all the other mediums that can be used. So there's lots of opportunity there. But at the same time, if you're going to release a podcast, it's really important that you can provide something different or bring something different to the table, as you've just described. And I guess that could come in many forms. But as you mentioned, Kevin MD, I mean, as I said, he's a prolific, he's in a category of his own, like in a category of one. And that is because he's built his own brand even beyond all of his mediums, right? And he does not appear to be afraid to speak his mind on various topics. So when going back to some of the formats of podcasting, which kind of format would you choose for what kind of purpose? So, sometimes podcasters will start a podcast because they're doing it for a very specific reason, whether it's gaining reach, whether it's business reasons, whether it's selling. I'm sure there's a lot of selling going on in podcasting, and informational, educational. So when doctors are considering the format of their podcasts, can you walk us through a few options that are quite common and why they're used for different purposes?
So if you have a strong opinion and don't mind sharing your opinion, if you are very articulate, if you potentially even write a lot, if you already have an established brand because of your specific opinion, then I think a show where you can just, share your thoughts is good. So you don't really need other speakers to be in there. That's one format. So basically a monologue of a blog post that you wrote, or thoughts, or something that you wish people to know. That kind of a format can even be shorter than longer interviews, for example. And that can be a good thing because people are busy. So it might be easier to build up the audience because of the short format if the content is good. The content.
How short is short? Are we saying 15-20 minutes or something like that?
I mean, even less. I know of podcasts that last for 5 to 10 minutes. So wow. The key thing there is to just be very consistent in publishing. So that's one of the key components that you need to keep in mind when starting a podcast, that if you do decide to do this, just don't do it now and then at the next one in 4 weeks, and then 3 episodes, one after the other, and then nothing for 2 months. You really need to be consistent. Decide, you can start just once a month, or once every 2 weeks, or once every 3 weeks, but just make sure that you're consistent in your publishing, because in essence, to succeed and to just kind of retain audience, apart from having good content, is also to start forming a habit with the audience, so they keep coming back because they're used to just hearing your voice every second Thursday in the month, right? So that's one way. And on the second hand, if you're really just more curious about what other people think, or feel a little bit less secure about your opinion, or just know that maybe you are too sensitive that somebody would criticize what you think, then a format where you basically talk to others and just let other vocalize their thoughts might be something that you would be more comfortable with.
So Tiasha, you chose the interview format as your predominant format, is that correct?
Yeah, I did.
Why did you choose that?
I guess just because I was going from the journalistic background. So as a journalist, you always explore, you always search. I'm driven by curiosity. I'm interested in things, and just I'm not an expert in everything, but I do like to talk to experts. So that was my decision.
Brilliant. I mean, I love the interview format myself. Maybe because when I'm a doctor and you're consulting with other patients, you're interviewing them essentially. I learn a lot from other people. And I think initially, you are a bit scared about how much you share your thoughts and opinions. But if you're getting feedback, positive, or even negative feedback, it means that people are listening.
Exactly.
People are listening, they're interested in what you have to say. And, it's really important to have a diversity of voices and representation, right? And so, if you're someone, and like speaking to the doctors who are listening, if you are someone who feels like your voice or what you have to say isn't being represented in the wider market, why not share it with the world? I mean, it's, today it's so easy to do, and so using so many mediums. Not everyone wants to look amazing when they're doing a webinar or even brush their hair, because I know some people just do it in their beds. And this is why the audio version of podcasting can actually be quite convenient also for a lot of people. But let's talk about the technical elements behind it, because I know that some people are like, what do I need to even just get it started, right? So tell me, I mean, Tiasha, what does someone need? They're literally saying, right, I'm going to start a podcast. What are the kind of basic steps that they would take to actually get to episode number 1?
Yeah, so I definitely would say that, you can start small. You can leave the quality of the audio for later episodes when you really decide that this is something that you want to invest your time in. So for a very brief start, what's enough is a quiet room, the best one being the bedroom, because there's a lot of there's carpets and just blankets in the bedrooms usually, so the sound is usually really good there. There's no echo usually, because of all these environmental factors. So you would just need a Zoom and a computer and a quiet room to start with, if you really want to do just the audio podcast. After a while, of course, it's you can start thinking about equipment such as having a proper microphone, maybe using something more podcast specific to Zoom, using post-production software. There's already a lot of these very easy to use things out there. So for example, a really awesome software that I use is called Descript, and the way it works is that it can enhance the sound of the recording. You can edit the recordings very easily and then export them before publishing. So those are kind of the basics. One thing that I might want to emphasize here is that, when you are just starting out, the first impression is the most important one. So while it is true that when you're just trying to figure out if podcasting is something that you want to do, maybe investing a little bit more in those first few episodes is super important, because if your first few episodes are not going to be good, if the sound's crappy, then the people won't have any reason to come back. So you lost their trust even before gaining it. It's easier to just once you're already established, if there's a sound issue once, then the audience will not take that against you in terms of coming back.
Mm-hmm. And how about the topics? Like, how do you choose some kind of hard-hitting topics, or even finding guests if you decide to go down the interview route?
Right. Well, that again goes back to the first question that we have. How are you going to position yourself? What angle and what topic do you feel comfortable talking about and choosing and sticking with? So in terms of guests, I guess there's two things there. One thing is that you need to decide how often you're going to publish, and that can impact how difficult it is going to be for you to get guests. Because if you're trying to book guests for every week, that becomes very intense in terms of trying to schedule people. You have to plan in advance, potentially have more episodes recorded in advance, so it doesn't happen that it's Tuesday and I don't have a scheduled interview for Friday, let's say. So there's a lot of planning involved, and usually people are quite open to talking to you if it's for an interview. So it gets easier over time, but you just have to try with trial and error kind of an approach and see who's going to respond and who not.
I mean, so I'm really interested to find out a bit more about how you mentioned, obviously you have to be very careful about who you choose to interview. They've got to speak very good English, they've got to be articulate, and obviously in that journey you found me. So so I guess the general question is, how do you choose your guests? What process do you go through to say, oh, I want that person on my show? How does that work for you?
So in my case, the whole planning process is a little bit complicated, at least in my view, because there are several things that I pay attention to when looking at how the episodes are going to look throughout the year. So the process in my case is specific because I try to look at various things. So the focus of my podcast is how do systems across the world adopt digital health and health tech. So every year I would try to prepare at least 2 to 3 region specific series of discussions. This year I'm working on one about Asia and one about Africa, and at the same time, or even other episodes that are not tied to a specific topic for a series of discussions. I try to have diverse speakers. So diversity for me means not just geographic diversity, so having speakers from across the world, not just US and Europe, but then at the same time also looking that I've got gender diversity, so it's not too many male or just female speakers. And when you count all those factors in, the whole scheduling process becomes quite difficult. To a certain degree, I'm lucky because after 5 years, I get a lot of pitches from PR representatives. So I choose some of the speakers from that pool. And then the second part of speakers is just looking at people that I admire and sending them a message if they would be willing to come on the show, or looking for recommendations from the people that are in my network. So there's basically 3 ways that I would do this.
Brilliant. And like, obviously you've got a full-time job. How do you manage to fit all of this in around that?
Well, evenings, weekends, and I also have 1 week that dedicated to podcasting this year. But I guess kind of the good thing of being in Central Europe and still having the majority of people in the US is that I just schedule the interviews for them in the evening. And it's a lot of work. It's definitely a lot of work, but at the same time, it's still maybe 1 interview per week or 2 interviews per week. So that's like 2 evenings that I would need to do the recordings. But yeah, it's just my personal choice.
I mean, I think that's really impressive because obviously you're committed and dedicated, and so you find time to work around all your other commitments.
Yeah.
And so I guess that's something really important for doctors to consider when they are setting up a podcast. Like, how are they going to fit that into their lifestyle? Like, as you mentioned earlier, listening to, being a podcast listener, you end up establishing a habit where you listen to it once, the new episode every time it's released. But being a podcast producer, you've got to develop a habit of doing the production and finding the speakers and planning ahead, which is totally doable. But it's just like, how can you work it around your day to day? And just to clarify, do you do all of the production?
Yeah.
That's so impressive.
I mean,
so impressive.
It is, I guess, but it's also true that by today, compared to when I started, things are much easier because of all the software that's already out. So for a while, I actually had some help with post-production, but now the software that I mentioned before, Descript, is actually so awesome that I just need 1 click to get rid of all the filler words, and the editing is simple. And I like to re-listen to the interviews that I do just to recall what the important messages were, because that's how you learn. If you just have a discussion once, maybe 1 or 2 things will stuck with you, but if you actually put the effort in the post-production and re-listening what the person was saying, then the impact on how much knowledge you retain is different. So that's why I like to also do the post-production myself and do the recaps of episodes on my own. So, and you are the author, so you can decide how much effort you're going to put in each of these steps based on what you want to achieve in the end. To me, knowledge enhancement and the understanding of the ins and outs of the digital health industry is what I want to get out. So it's important for me to really analyze what was said.
Okay, brilliant. And moving on to measurable returns of podcasting. So as I kind of indicated earlier, some people are looking to podcast for the purposes of getting their voice out there, for business reasons, for marketing reasons, for sales reasons. In running your own podcasts, what are the key metrics that you look at to determine whether you are doing a good job?
Mostly I'm just looking at the number of downloads and just assessing how those numbers change over time. And because my numbers keep rising in terms of the audience, that's good enough for me. Because my primary focus and my primary mission is to give out diverse and quality content. That's why I also have a little bit of a problem with sponsors. I'm very conservative around that, because as quickly as you go to take on sponsors, that might impact the content or the quality of the content that you're going to put out. So if I do decide to do a sponsorship, it has to make sense from the editorial perspective first, before anything else.
And how does it generally work with sponsors? Do they come to you? Do you go to them? Like a bit of both, I guess. Like what do sponsors want out of a podcast anyway?
Well, I guess it depends on the client that you work with, but I would think about sponsors once you really want to turn this into a professional kind of a side gig or full-time gig. And then, you've got different models that you would go through. But in essence, it's all about also the sponsors getting their voice and message out, similar as any other form of marketing.
Okay. And I guess one of the benefits of podcasting is that it's always going to be there. It's not going anywhere, right? So there's a legacy for that recording to just be available and be found at any time.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of sponsors, there's always different routes you can go. So, for example, there's dynamic ads or just baked in ads. So, for example, if you do dynamic ads, that means that you would just publish an ad for a certain period of time. And after a while, if somebody would listen to the episode from the past, that ad wouldn't be there anymore. So there's various models that you can take and go after.
Okay. And the baked in ads are the ones where it's actually just part of the
where you would actually have to manually change and cut something out and repost it, so that wouldn't be there anymore.
Brilliant. And just going back to yourself as someone who is highly influential in health tech, what opportunities has running this podcast offered to you as an individual?
Okay, so it's I wouldn't really consider myself influential. That's the first thing. But thank you.
How many downloads? How many years? How many episodes?
Those numbers,
really?
No, yeah. Those numbers aren't public. But thanks for the compliment. To me, okay, so I guess this is gonna sound cheesy, I guess, but just really getting that industry knowledge and industry insight and being able to position myself as expert, that's to me the biggest benefit, because then that can then also impact all the other job opportunities and the future opportunities for me. You, by knowing the industry, you know better where you might potentially want to go, and also understand healthcare from so many different perspectives than you would if you just worked on your day job. So I work in healthcare IT, and through the show I can understand many things beyond just what we're doing, and I just find that very helpful for the understanding of the broader picture. and then there's the speaking opportunities, moderation opportunities that I get, because that's something that I know that I'm good at and enjoy doing.
And so one of my last questions is that obviously you've got a young family, and you have quite extensive global reach. So my question is, will we see your child on your podcast at some point in the future? It's like, because obviously he was running around earlier, so is he quite interested in what you're doing and be like, why is mommy talking to a microphone? Like,
yeah, oh yeah, I mean, he's obviously, definitely interested in computers, especially since we are very strict in terms of screen time. He doesn't get any screen time unless he's sick, just minimum amounts when he's sick. But would he be on the podcast? Yeah, maybe if I still do this for over 20 years and he starts some successful digital health business, then yes. Otherwise, no. I am very strict about just separating that personal part to the professional life. So social media is something that's going to be his choice when he's old enough to decide whether or not he wants to be visible or not. And I do not feel that that's good for kids anyway. So if I have anything to say to that, I will discourage him from trying to be visible too fast and for the wrong reasons.
So I mean, actually that's a really important message to share with doctors about visibility over time as a doctor, and balancing that with, a lot of doctors are a bit concerned about what they say and then being reported to the regulatory body depending on what they say. And there's always a risk of doing that, especially when you're in the public domain, right? So I mean, even as a journalist, you've got some degree of regulation. So how do you manage that? And has that ever been a concern for you?
No, I mean, it hasn't been a concern for me, and that's simply because I just stick to the journalistic principles concerning ethics, concerning checking information, and making sure that it's not about me, it's about the content. So even my show it's not very opinionated. So I try to share industry knowledge. So no problems on that side.
Brilliant. And any final tips for doctors who are considering to go down that podcasting journey, Tiasha?
Well, I would say that, by today, there's so many podcasts that are already out there. So when you're just starting out, I would just recommend maybe networking with other podcasters, because then you can share experiences, get some motivation even when things don't go as well, and just keep on going. Don't give up too quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's excellent advice. I mean, this is it's a very new podcast. I have to say, I have not been listening to podcasts until very recently. And actually, one of the first podcasts I consistently listened to, that podcaster is now one of my coaches. Which really has transformed the way that I do things. And then, having featured on quite a few podcasts over the years, and more recently, again, just going through that experience as an individual has really helped me to understand the different formats, what can work, and really also understand the back end of it, some things that we've discussed, such as some of the metrics, like you mentioned, that downloads is one thing you look at, but also making sure that you keep the industry informed, and for others it's purely about money and reach and all of that stuff, and it's fine. I think it's just being clear as to why you are starting the podcast, what the main mission is behind it, and then also wondering, like, is the podcast about you, or is it about something greater than you? And I mean, we talked about Kevin MD, and you could argue it's all about him, but it's also something greater than him. But his brand is greater than him in so many ways, if you know what I mean, Kevin MD.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? So And so, because I know, for example, we were talking to who was I talking to recently? James from SomX. So he runs the Health Tech podcast, and he actually started that before SomX, but he's continued it through his businesses and his life. And that's something that he kind of owns, and that's him in itself. Because you could decide to move on from, say, your podcast if it's linked to a business, but the question is, do you want to be keeping that for longevity, or is it just specifically for business, like we talked about medical journals and companies that have podcasts for themselves? So I mean, it's a lot to think about, and I really want to thank you so much for your time, your insights, and everything that you're doing for health tech as well. I mean, it's really, really impressive and really amazing. And actually, my final question is, do we need more women's voices in health tech?
I'm always interested to hear from women, again, especially if they're from countries outside the US and Europe. I more or less have more than enough speakers from there. But yeah, definitely. I mean, suggestions are always welcome. You do have to keep in mind that, the supply is high. So, I mentioned before how many factors I have to include in my decision making. So don't be disappointed if you get turned down. It's just part of the journey. But yeah, definitely always interested in new speakers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tiasha.
Thank you.